Okay, without further ado, we now have reached the we have now reached the stage where we're going to commence with the discussion on banking and the Holy Land. And before me, on the side of me, in front of you, we have two panelists. We've already introduced, of course, Maulana Imran. Later on, we will do that again because on my left is a very dear friend of mine, Terry Crawford-Browne. I've known Terry for many years, in fact. A stalwart in the community, in fact, an activist who has done tremendous work. I hope you don't mind me saying one of the whistleblowers on the arms deal. I hope Terry don't mind me saying that. And for that, we are eternally grateful, because if it wasn't for Terry Crawford-Browne's tireless work in this area, none of us would have known anything about the arms deal. And many of the revelations has been as a result of Terry Crawford-Browne's tireless work in this area. But of course, Terry Crawford-Browne is much more than that. He's in fact not just a local activist, but international activist. He's represented the World Council of Churches, in fact, as part of an ecumenical team who went to Palestine as a peace, as part of a Peace Corps, a group of people who went there, not just to investigate the human rights abuses by the Israeli entity, but also to go there as peace monitors. And for that, I'm sure Terry Crawford-Browne will be able to inform us a lot of his experiences there. He's also, I know he doesn't like me to harp on this, the author of two very important texts, which I hope he will purchase. Unfortunately, he hasn't got any with him. And that is none other than The Eye on the Money, which is it's available on ebooks, yes. It's out of print, yes. And of course, his latest work, Eye on Diamonds, which I'm hoping that he's going to focus on in the talk, because I think Israel plays a very important role in the concept of the blood diamonds, the conflict diamonds. So hopefully Terry will focus very much on that. So yeah, so the format is as follows. I forgot, I should have actually told you the format. Terry Crawford-Browne will start off with 20 minutes. That will be followed by Maulana Imran Hosein for 20 minutes. After that, they will have a short debate, or discussion, I would say rather, dialogue, more a dialogue rather. And then we will open the floor for discussion from the floor, and we hope that you will feverishly be taking notes, because this is one of what I would call a hot topic. So, Terry, I'll hand over to you. Terry Crawford-Browne, please proceed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this program. Switched on? Working? It's on. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No.
Terry, is it possible to stand there so everyone can see you?
Yeah, fine, okay.
Because we got ladies right at the back. Hello, what are you doing? Oh, you want to come and get it?
That's fine. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Shukran for the invitation to participate in this program. I'm Terry Crawford-Browne, as Fakhri has said. I used to be a banker before I became a revolutionary. And my focus was international banking for one of the major South African banks. But in the mid-1980s, South Africa was on the track to civil war. It would have been catastrophic, and thankfully we averted it. And I would say one of the major reasons we averted it was because of the banking sanctions campaign. If you will, in October 1985, many of you from this area will remember the Trojan horse incident just up in Thornton Road, where the security forces killed 3 people and injured 13 others. And a week later, I was sent by the South African Council of Churches, by Alan Bussack and Dr. Bears Nodia, to begin the banking sanctions campaign against the apartheid government and the South African banks. And the reason for that was that because of the role of the US dollar as the settlement currency in foreign exchange markets. If you didn't have access to the seven major New York banks, you couldn't trade with Japan or Germany. And so we realized this was the pressure point. If we could close off the South African access to those accounts, then we could leverage that up into constitutional change. We are very fortunate in our timing. There were parallels with the civil rights movement in the United States. It was also the beginning of the end of the Cold War. But particularly in the United States, there were the parallels of the civil rights movement. And so between 1985, bit by bit, a year later, the United States Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, then the Commonwealth and the United Nations began to realize that banking sanctions was really the pressure point. Because a war between the South African Defense Force and the opposition, the ANC, the PNC, and others would have been suicidal. We just don't know what the consequences might have been. Unfortunately, that is what led to, with our pressure, we had 5 points we kept pushing. The end of the state of emergency, release political prisoners, unban political organizations, the end of apartheid legislation, and constitutional negotiations for a non-racial democracy. And that was the background to President de Klerk's announcement in February 1990, and when Nelson Mandela was then released 9 days later. So running on from there, that was 1985 to 1990, and by 1994, thankfully, we had South Africa's transition to a post-apartheid South Africa. Running on from there, in 2009, my daughter challenged me to say, "Dad, it's time for you to go to Palestine. Applications close on Tuesday." So I applied on Monday, and I was accepted on Tuesday to join the World Council of Churches program. It is called the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program for Palestine and Israel. And if you will, I'll just turn around so you can have a look at what I'm wearing, because we were known as the Vests. This was our uniform. And so the first year I was we went on a 90-day program. The first year I was in Jerusalem and Al-Quds, and the second year in Bethlehem. We were there to work with the Israeli peace movement, with the Israelis, and with the Palestinian peace movement in Bethlehem and the areas around Bethlehem. But our primary purpose was to monitor the checkpoints. We would be at the checkpoints at 4 o'clock in the morning and a bit before 4 o'clock in the morning. And you will know about the apartheid wall. You've seen pictures of the apartheid wall. It is really horrendous. We never had anything like it in South Africa. We did not have apartheid roads as they have in Palestine. And the security system of permits really is far, far more invasive than the pass laws that we had in South Africa. And for those, we were a team of 27 people from 12 countries, 3 of us from South Africa. And when the Palestinians would ask us, "Where are you from?" and we would say, "Janub Afrika," and they'd say, "Mandela, Mandela." And we're very, very popular. It was fantastic. So I'd like to encourage any of you who are interested in applying. Although it is organized by the World Council of Churches, it's open to Christians, Muslims, Jews, people without faith. And the young people who have the computer skills, or the elderly people who have the experience, between the two, if you can spend 3 months, it is a fantastic program. I've had people saying that as diplomats, they were never as well briefed as we were. We spent, as I say, 3 months, because that's what the Israelis give you as a visa when you arrive. We were there to let the Israeli army know that they were being watched, and the Palestinians that they had not been forgotten. Now, during the course of my second time in Bethlehem, I was asked to fly to London to talk to the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, looking into human rights abuses and the failure of the international community, the United Nations, the European Union, and others, to enforce international law on the violation of human rights by the Israeli government. I flew to London and I spoke at the Russell Tribunal there when they were having hearings. They had hearings in Barcelona in March 2010, London November 2010, then in Cape Town November 2011, and then subsequently in New York and Brussels. So the Russell Tribunal has now completed its work, but its purpose was to move international opinion in favor of non-violent exposure to what is happening. So I flew to London and I spoke about our experiences with the banking sanctions campaign, and that now, almost 30 years later, technology has advanced dramatically. Now, instead of New York and some of the crazy things we did, I went toy-toying on Park Avenue with Jesse Jackson as one experience. But now everything is now driven by computers. And the computer system that authenticates interbank transfers between banks is now located in Belgium. It's called the SWIFT system, meaning the Society Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, and that authenticates transactions to and from 9,000 banks around the world. So if you're not in SWIFT, you're not essentially financially able to transact business. And so what I proposed is that this is the leverage point. Every bank has a SWIFT code. The SWIFT code for South Africa, for instance, is ZA. The SWIFT code for Israel is IL. And the fifth and the sixth letter of the SWIFT code identifies the country of domicile. As I say, there is now a mountain of evidence accumulated by the Russell Tribunal, but many, many other people, including the United Nations, about the abuses of human rights law by the Israelis, and that Israel violates the International Convention Against Apartheid as a crime against humanity. There is a huge quantity of evidence about war profiteering by Israelis, not only in Palestine, but also in Africa and Latin America, in the drug trade, in the diamond trade, in pillaging natural resources in the Congo, in Zimbabwe, in Angola, which are then used, they're transferred back via the Israeli banks and used to fund the occupation of Palestine, to build the settlements and whatever goes with the occupation. So the Israeli banks are all hugely, hugely complicit in it. And you cannot separate what the Israeli banks are doing on the one side of the Green Line and what they're doing on the other side of the Green Line in the occupied territories. And they deliberately attempt to obliterate that distinction. So the Israeli banks are all very much involved. And what I have proposed, and what programmatically would be quite simple, the difficulty is the political issue, is to get a court order in Belgium or in Holland to order SWIFT to reprogram its computers to suspend transactions to and from all Israeli banks until they comply with particular conditions. As I told you, we had 5 conditions we used in our South African banking campaign, and similarly I proposed 5 conditions for the SWIFT campaign against Israeli banks. And I tie it also to the issue of nuclear weapons and the whole issue with the confrontation with Iran. And Israel, as we know, has perhaps 250 or 300 nuclear warheads, and yet has been screaming about the possibility of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons despite Iranian denials. So what I've proposed, and I've been discussing this with the BDS campaign in Ramallah, that if we could get a court order requiring SWIFT to suspend its transactions to and from Israeli banks until 1, Israel agrees to relinquish its nuclear weapons and to accede to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and 2, agrees to release immediately all Palestinian political prisoners, 3, agrees to end its occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and to dismantle the apartheid wall, 4, recognizes the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and 5, acknowledges the right of return of Palestinian refugees. These are 5 conditions, and once, if the Israeli government complied with them, and then you would even the scales so that negotiations would become possible between the Palestinians and the Israelis. for a future, hopefully peaceful transition in that part of the world. And both communities have huge potential to contribute to that region. It's radical, but it is, I believe, what is necessary for a peaceful transformation, because a confrontation would be suicidal. It has been supported by the BDS campaign, and which is modeled after our South African experience. South Africa is the only country where sanctions have actually worked over the last 50, 60 years. The Americans have been applying sanctions against Cuba. It has cost the Cuban people an estimated $1 trillion. It has caused huge hardship for the Cuban people. They've applied sanctions against Zimbabwe and many other countries. But they've been driven by an agenda within the United States, rather than an attempt to bring peaceful resolution of conflict. There will inevitably be conflict anywhere in the world, but if we can do it non-violently, it offers huge possibilities for peace. We've then, just 10 days ago, raised this in Parliament here in Cape Town, with the Committee for International Cooperation Development has held a conference on South Africa's foreign policy with Cuba, Western Sahara, and Palestine. And you may recall that President Nelson Mandela, back in 1997, declared that South Africa would not truly be free until Palestine is free. So in that memory, it really is the priority to liberate Palestine from this colonial oppression established as a consequence of the British imperialism of a century ago with the Balfour Declaration. Israel and Palestine, the issue is really one of the major threats to international peace. And if we in South Africa can make that contribution in the international community through the BRICS association of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the non-aligned movement, the United Nations. This, I believe, is a means of carrying forward. It's a system that could bring the Israeli banking system to a collapse very rapidly, but it would not have the long-term negative consequences of trade sanctions, which are typically unenforceable. It's the poor, it's the workers who carry the consequences of trade sanctions. You must hit the financial and political elites who have the clout to say that, hey, the game is up, it's time to negotiate. And then once that negotiation takes place, then the sanctions can be reversed without having caused major damage. I think probably my 20 minutes is almost up, isn't it? I have 5 more minutes. Okay. Yes. As I say, there is a huge amount of Israeli war profiteering in Africa. The Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, should be one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but it has been plundered and now is facing the consequences of what is known as Africa's First World War. It's a war based on plundering natural resources wanted by the First World armaments industry. The same is true of Angola. Diamonds in Zimbabwe are used to maintain Mugabe in power. The diamonds are then laundered through Dubai and cut and polished in Israel for sale in the international market. The same, as I say, is also true elsewhere, drugs in South America. But the international banking system is highly, highly complicit in this. You're all familiar with what is referred to as the criminal underworld. There is more and more recognition today of what is known as the criminal overworld. These are corrupt governments, corrupt bankers, corrupt lawyers, corrupt auditors, in other words, the elites of society who use their privilege to pass legislation, to get government programs, to plunder the public purse. And they hide their their profits via what are known increasingly as the Treasure Islands. These are the former British colonies in the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, the Channel Islands, and it ultimately relates back to London, and the city of London is increasingly known as the most corrupt square mile anywhere on the planet Earth. The British do corruption with panache. And so we face the consequences, and it is very important that we begin to address these issues, because the war business, in conjunction with the banking business, is what is the cause of the horrors that are being inflicted around the world, Syria at the moment, for instance. And part of this, as I may, was that Margaret Thatcher in 1985 negotiated with Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia the so-called £40 million Al-Yamama deal for BAE, or what used to be known as British Aerospace, to sell £43 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. Obviously, the bribes in that were huge, but more importantly, there were 3 provisions with this. And in England, they cannot investigate this because it is covered by the Official Secrets Act. So when they've had an inquiry, even that report is still suppressed from British parliamentarians. But the essence of it is that Saudi Arabia ships oil consigned to the Bank of England, which then distributes the oil to either Shell or to BP, according to a formula. And over the years, a huge fund has developed. And the purpose of that fund is threefold. 1, to guarantee British and American support for the Saudi royal family against domestic insurrection. 2, to use the pricing of oil in US dollars to underpin the dollar as the foundation of the international monetary system, so that if Iran or Iraq or Libya or Venezuela start talking about wanting to be paid in euros or gold, the next thing we know is we have regime change. And thirdly, it is to fund covert destabilization of resource-rich countries in Asia and Africa. So in the 1980s, Prince Bandar was involved in organizing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And still, 30 years later, we're still facing the consequences of that. So it's the destabilization of resource-rich countries, including Africa, to pillage those resources, particularly oil, on behalf of the West. Prince Bandar, as you may know, has also most recently been exposed as having been responsible for distributing the chemical weapons in Syria by Al-Qaeda. The intention was to accuse the al-Assad regime of the atrocities, and therefore to provoke a British and American attack against Syria, preparatory to attacking Iran, with the instigation of Israel and Saudi Arabia. That, amazingly, was exposed by President Putin of Russia. We have him to thank. And there's been a step back from that, and the prospect of conflict is not as bad as it was a few months ago. But what's come out of this quite extraordinarily is a new alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Israel believes it has a lobby in Europe and the United States. And the combination of that lobby with the power of Saudi oil and Saudi money means that they can dictate to European governments, European and American governments, so that they can then control circumstances in the Middle East and beyond to maintain both the Saudi government and the Israeli Zionist government in office, and further destabilize the world, and doing so as proxies for the international war business, particularly the American and the British war business. I think my 20 minutes is up. Thank you very much. Shukran. What Imran said. The destruction of money is a pathway to revolution. It hurts the poor, the rich profit from it. It compounds our problems, and it is essential that we get back to honest money. And that has been the destruction of the last century, chipping away, and particularly since the Second World War, when the world has been on a dollar system, which enables the US to intervene around the world because it is funded on chemical paper that no one else can produce. It enables them to intervene militarily. And that has to come to an end. We had hoped it would in 2009 with the financial crash, and that it was an opportunity for Obama in those early days to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, within weeks, it was evident he was more beholden to the bankers than he was to ending wars. And he, as we know, has continued the wars he inherited and has severely compounded them with drones and all kinds of other atrocities. But it is only made possible because of the role of your chemical paper. It's absolutely essential to get back to honest money. Gold has provided the basis of that for thousands of years. In fact, one scholar would argue that in terms of the First World War, when a century ago this year, the First World War would only have lasted 6 months had Britain stayed on the gold standard, because it would have run out of money and could no longer have pursued that war. But it abandoned the gold standard, and the war went on for 4 years with horrendous consequences, which was then, and the Second World War was simply an extension of the first. And we still haven't recovered from the consequences of that. So yes, honest money is absolutely essential. How we get back to it is hugely problematic. The Chinese and others are talking about the need to bring gold back into the system. China is now the #1 gold producer in the world. South Africa was for almost a century, but our gold industry has collapsed. It was plundered by Anglo-American and others, and then as soon as South Africa had served their purpose, they are no longer South African companies and have moved to London. But although South Africa still has 50% of the world's gold reserves, as we know, these are now very, very deep mines. It's very hot, it's very dangerous, and very expensive to recover the gold at these levels. And so whether our gold mining industry can ever recover is problematic, and whether we can again bring gold into the foundation of the monetary system has got to be explored. Maybe new technology, maybe we can put robots down there to recover the gold, but I don't know how we're going to do it as yet.
Okay, Terry, you are the banker, so it's only fair. The audience would be more interested in hearing your views. So if I do some of the questioning, I hope you don't mind. I made reference to Dr. Mahathir. And when we met yesterday, I spoke to you about Dr. Mahathir earlier. And his proposals about conducting trade using local currencies, and then every quarter the central banks will meet and the balance of payments will be in gold. How do you evaluate such a proposal?
I think it needs to be examined, but obviously the country has to eventually have a balance. And if it's only going to trade in local currencies, and there becomes a limit, otherwise it becomes overly indebted in those local currencies. So there has to be a check and balance to enable it to transfer that gold in, say, 3 months' time, that they're going to clear it in 3 months, that they don't just run up more and more debt in terms of their local currency, and then 3 months' time are unable to pay the gold. The other dimension to it is, however, that if the price of their local currency falls, and that has huge issues of inflation and social unrest rand was worth $1.40 instead of now 11 rand to the dollar. That is the price of our mismanagement and the destruction of our currency by the apartheid government, but has also continued since 1994. In 94, the rand was worth 3 rand 40 to the dollar. It's now 11 rand, and who knows where it's going until we begin to turn this round. One of the things, if I may, that's up for investigation by the public protector at the moment, and we had expected her report some months ago, was whether there is actually any gold left at the Reserve Bank. Imran mentioned Congressman Ron Paul, who's been trying to get the Americans to audit whether there's any gold left in Fort Knox. There's a suspicion it's all been given to the Chinese. But similarly, there's a suspicion that the apartheid government transferred our gold reserves to Zurich during the apartheid days. And in 1997, the government contracted with a British firm to recover the monies that had been siphoned out of South Africa by the Broederbond in the dying days of apartheid, in collusion with the Reserve Bank. And included in that was $200 million worth of $200 million in banknotes taken out of the country by the then Minister of Finance. But they've been sitting on trying to squelch this. A documentary film was made, commissioned by the BBC and by the SABC, which has refused to show the film twice. And how much longer, but it's estimated that perhaps 200 to 300 billion rand was siphoned out of the country in the dying days of apartheid, and that those funds should one way or other be recovered, which is what I'd also say with the arms deal. We need that money back so that it can then be applied for social upliftment issues.
I don't know whether this question is fair or not, because you're not a lawyer, but you're a banker, you can try. The Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund, I told you, prohibits the use of gold as money. Would this government-to-government agreement for the use of gold for swapping balance of payments would violate that prohibition?
I wouldn't think it would. In terms of the IMF, the dollar was convertible into gold at $35 per ounce of gold. And that was the foundation of the IMF system, and other current countries pegged their currencies to the dollar. The rand, the pound first at $4 to the pound. The pound was devalued $2.80 to the dollar, $2.80 to the pound. The rand, as half a pound, was 1 rand 40, $1.40 to the rand rather, and so that was how the gold reserves were used, but I see no reason why that cannot, and I think the world realizes it's high time to modify those arrangements. They were negotiated at the end of the Second World War, and it's a very different world today. And the rest of the international community has got to have its say and its involvement in it. We're no longer the colonial society of the 1940s. So I think that it could well be modified.
Okay.
Yes.
One last question, Terry. We are exploring an alternative, a macro alternative that can bypass the banking system. We are of the opinion that the banking system and the larger monetary system were crafted to facilitate the pursuit of a Zionist agenda in Israel, so that Israel might be able to establish its political and economic and monetary dominion over the Arabs and over the world. And this is linked with our eschatology, so this false Messiah will then declare, I am the true Messiah. If we are to locate an alternative that can bypass the banking system, the best person to comment on that would be an ex-banker. how feasible would be a proposal to try to persuade Russia, which is becoming more friendly now to the world of Islam, as it realizes day by day that the Zionist encirclement of Russia is closing in now with weapons, with nuclear missiles all around Russia. And Russia now acquiring some backbone and standing up, that we persuade Russia to recognize gold and silver as legal tender alongside the ruble. And when gold and silver are recognized as legal tender, then while our governments were still in the grip of the IMF and the World Bank and Washington, the Muslim peoples around the world are becoming increasingly convinced that we should return to gold and silver, particularly the poor, so that merchants can travel and can buy and sell directly using a common currency. And this can expand the day when, I don't know how long it will take to get the Chinese on board. But if you get Russia and you get China, and you get the Muslim peoples with the governments not being able to prevent the people, you'll be able to establish a trading bloc in the world which will give us some breathing space that we can buy and sell, bypassing the banking system.
I think it depends on the development of BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And it's very early stages. But all of those are countries that traditionally have been very focused on gold. So yes, it needs it needs a lot more thought as to how to restructure the whole international monetary system, and everyone, I think, around the world agrees that the system is broken. And somehow or other it's got to be, and the Americans will obviously resist as long as they can, because we are now on a black gold standard, essentially of Saudi oil. Because as I explained, oil is priced in US dollars. If we can break that, and also I believe, the whole banking system, not quite apart from the international side of it, is hugely corrupt and needs to be restructured. But as far as the Zionist control of the banking system, again, I believe we've got to tackle the issue of Israel in the Middle East. And that increasingly, even the younger generation of Americans are embarrassed by what is going on in Israel in their name. 80% of American Jews are in fact Reform Jews, who are not even considered to be Jewish in terms of the Orthodox influence is in Israel. And more American Jews are wanting to dissociate themselves. And what developed with us in the 1980s, when South Africa thought we had gold, we could tell the world where to get off. South Africa became too much hassle. It became known as the hassle factor. That South Africa was contributing 1% to the profits of international corporations, but we were causing 10% of the hassle of companies having to justify why they were still dealing with apartheid South Africa. And eventually the companies said it's just not worth the hassle. And I think that's going to happen with Israel, and I think it's going to happen more rapidly than with us. But we've got to, and then I would hope that the Americans themselves will see that they do not have to control the world, as has been their agenda since the Second World War. They've got more than enough problems of their own within the United States. And that we then, as part and parcel of it, move on to a relationship of respect between each other, instead of the perception that America can do as it pleases.
Start. The first question was about the narrative. I think that was directed at you, Terry.
To me, yes. Yes, until 500 years ago, China really dominated the world. And then 500 years ago, a lot of it because of the role of guns and weapons, then began the European domination of the world. And that's coming to an end. So I think that narrative is about to change quite dramatically. Okay? And that's what makes the 21st century, I think, fascinating time. But I think that narrative is changing. Colonialism, imperialism, with the backing of weapons and war. Okay. And secondly, Naeem, the question of
Before you turn to the second question, may I offer a comment?
Sure.
Please. I think it's a dialogue, so I think we can allow that.
On the contrary, I don't see white dominion or European dominion over the world diminishing. I see the opposite picture, something that they call full spectrum dominance. A civilization hijacked by people who are running recklessly amok, waging war after war after war after war, shamelessly and without any concern for law and for morality. And I think we are moving in a direction now of a worse form of slavery than the one we had before.
I would agree, if I may, that this war, so-called war on terror launched by Bush, but I don't think it's going to work. I think the pendulum is going to swing. But yes, I agree, this war on terror is absolutely odious, it's horrendous.
Please.
The question that followed up next.
Yes, social ills. Yes. The question of social ills of random and unrestricted lending. It leads both locally and internationally into what is known as a debt trap, that you'll get into a spiral that you're simply on a treadmill and can never catch up with. The consequences are social upheaval and impoverishment in the first instance, and then ultimately upheaval. And I think this is one of the irresponsible features of banking, that bankers lend and lend and lend, and not just bankers now. Every store encourages people to borrow way beyond their capacity. And so one gets into a debt trap. And the consequences are severe. And the same is true internationally. That, for instance, the question of Zaire with Mobutu, the international bankers thought that they could lend more and more and more to Zaire. Of course, Mobutu siphoned most of it into Europe and elsewhere, and they left the people of Zaire, or now the Democratic Republic of Congo, to face the consequences. It's absolutely reckless. And this is the crux of where we stand at the moment because of that reckless practice over the last 30, 40 years. Our monetary system, yes, we used to be part of what was known as the sterling area when the British dominated the world, when London was the center of the financial system, in the sense that New York has followed London, but London was the center in the so-called sterling area. And we used to have the South African pound. In 1960, it was decided to decimalize our system. At that point, the British pound sterling and the South African pound were quoted at $2.80 per pound, both South African and English. So when we took half a pound to decimalize it into 100 cents, the exchange rate for the rand against the dollar became $1.40 per rand. So it stemmed from that. I would say that we have certainly benefited from decimalizing our currency, but it's a different issue that since then as one of the consequences of the mismanagement of our economy under the apartheid system and the continued mismanagement of our currency by the Reserve Bank. We've seen this catastrophic collapse of the rand, so that South Africa has been one of the worst performing economies for 30, 40 years. Not because of the decimalization, but because of other mismanagement of the currency by the Reserve Bank.
I don't know, Mola, would you like to comment on any of those? In that case, there was a question posed directly to you, Maulana,
Yes.
from the international audience on
Yes.
the Zionist attack on Russia. If I could also just extend that question and ask, how does this tie in to your thesis that this would lead to the Zionist control of the world?
The Zionist attack on the Russian currency already took place. And the ruble was plummeting.
Did plummet?
And there was widespread poverty in Russia, and Russia was threatening to become a third world country. How long ago was this? Was it about 20 years?
90s, in the 1990s.
1990s, yeah. Terry would probably be in a better position to estimate what is the possibility of another attack being launched on Putin's ruble, and the likelihood of success of another attack on Putin's ruble. I am conscious of the fact that the very great rise in the price of oil has given to the Arabs wealth that they could never have dreamt of. But it has also benefited Russia, because Russia is a major exporter of oil. Europe, Western Europe, is very much dependent on Russian oil. And Russia is also one of the world's greatest exporters of natural gas. And Russia has fabulous reserves of natural gas. Terry might be able to explain to what extent would a careful and judicious exploitation of these resources, oil and gas, in the context of such a favorable market, assist Putin in keeping the ruble less vulnerable to a Zionist attack. This is for the banker. Will the Zionists attack the ruble again? I have no doubt it's going to come. It's a multi-pronged, multi-dimensional attack on Russia that's taking place. And they are not going to rest content until that nuclear war takes place. It's a fight to the finish. Why are they doing it? I call it a pig-headed obsession of establishing full spectrum dominance over the whole world. And rational and sane analysts cannot understand how is it that a people can become so insane, but that's what they are.
Yes, if I may, I agree that I think the Russians, for the moment, because of the rise in the price of oil, don't face an imminent attack on their currency. But surprisingly, I think it's more the Americans who may face the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
You remember the scandal around Bernie Madoff, the trader in New York, and they're still trying to hush that one up with the connivance of, for instance, J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest American bank, has now been fined $1.2 billion, I think it was, $1.2 billion, for its deliberate cover-up of Bernie Madoff's escapades over a period of 30 years. Now, what he was doing was siphoning funds to Israel. And I think to huge embarrassment. And it's not just Bernie Madoff, but it's been drug dealers in Colombia and elsewhere that have also been siphoning funds to support Israel. And as money laundering is now increasingly considered to be a huge security issue worldwide, I think the involvement of people, either Israeli nationals themselves or people sympathetic to Israel, have possibly overplayed their hand. That the time is coming, rather as with South Africa, that we are becoming too much of a hassle factor. And I don't think Israel really has the clout, as even American generals are now beginning to speak out more and more. Israel is a liability rather than an asset. And hopefully that will save us from the kind of war that you and I fear. But I think the time is running short, that the international community has got to take action pretty fast.
I got a question. The Sheikh often mentions the dollar is in ICU, but you, with your experience and background in banking, how do you view the dollar? Is it a terminal patient on the way to its collapse, or is there something that can save it?
If I may revert back to what I did mention earlier, that countries such as Iraq or Iran or Venezuela or Libya, who have started saying they want payment for oil in euros or gold, have faced the problem of regime change. And in specifically Libya with Muammar Gaddafi, when he started saying he wanted payment in gold, suddenly he was removed. So suddenly the same thing there'll be more and more pressure brought against Turkey. As regarding whether the dollar is terminal, you may remember that in 2012, the gold price rocketed from $1,400 per ounce to $19, and subsequently last year collapsed back to $1,200. And suddenly the expectations in 2012 of the of the gold price continuing to rise to 2,500 or higher floundered. It seems that the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, in conjunction with New York banks, speculated massively in order to collapse the price of gold, with all kinds of fraudulent derivative trading to that purpose. Gold has now recovered slightly. It's early days yet as to whether this is the beginning of another bull run on gold. But and it might be early days yet to say the dollar is in a terminal condition. But certainly the system is broken. The expectations in 2009 with the financial crash were papered over. With billions of dollars were pumped into the system, and we haven't seen the consequences of that yet in terms of inflation. But it could well be that we will have another bout of inflation internationally. We're seeing it in, for instance, the oil price and other inflationary aspects. And if they go through another inflationary cycle, it could well spark a rush into gold. There are people who are, again, forecasting a movement into 2,000, 2,500, and even some people saying $10,000 per ounce of gold. But it's indicative that the dollar is in a very, very shaky situation, and so it uses its muscle to keep the Europeans and others into line, and particularly the oil-producing countries, to make sure that they price oil in dollars. We're on a dollar standard still because of oil being priced in dollars.
May I offer a comment?
Please, proceed.
I think that it's not only market forces which are going to determine the fate of the US dollar, but in addition, the big plan, which is that we have to move away from paper money in which you can have anonymous transactions, to a new universal unitary currency for the whole world, which will be entirely electronic, and in which there are no such things as anonymous transfers, anonymous transactions. So every single transaction would be recorded. You have an electronic trail, you can't get away. The time has now come for the transfer of power. This is the eschatology, the Antichrist, the three stages of the Antichrist. The Prophet said, alayhi salatu wasalam, a day like a year, a day like a month, a day like a week. And in a day like a year, the world experienced Pax Britannica and the sterling pound as the universal currency, His Majesty the sterling pound. And then came Pax Americana, and the sterling pound was humiliated at Bretton Woods and was replaced by the US dollar. The British humiliation was pathetic at Bretton Woods. And Pax Americana and the US dollar. And now we are on the verge of movement to stage 3, which is the last stage, where a new ruling state must emerge to replace the United States, and a new monetary system to replace the sterling pound, the US dollar. What it's going to be. We said that we thought it was Israel who's going to try to replace the United States. And then we were told, it's really difficult to believe it, isn't it? That Israel controls the US Congress? Did you hear that?
Mm-hmm.
And that Israel controls the US government? Who said so? He just died. A man named Ariel Sharon. And he did it when he was Prime Minister. He said, we control America. So it's not far-fetched then to conceive of Israel as a ruling state in the world when Israel is already ruling the world from behind the curtain. So now we have to look forward to a change in the monetary system. And this was why I was able to anticipate more than 15 years ago that the US dollar was going to collapse. I said, it's not just that it will collapse, I said it must collapse in order to give way to a new monetary system, which I thought would be electronic. Money you can't see, and money you can't touch, and only donkeys of the world will accept that as money. I think this is why the US dollar is now going to be demonetized. Maybe some war would take place and they would use that as the opportunity to demonetize the US dollar, bring something as a makeshift replacement in order to facilitate the movement towards one world currency, electronic money.
Yes, so thank you very much to the panelists. On behalf of the Islamic Network, we would like to thank both panelists for a very enlightening discussion, and I'm sure in our memory banks it will last for a long time. I'm sure we're going home with new information infused with new insights, and inshallah we pray that those who have been here have benefited, and those you imparted to will benefit from your increasing insights now that you've acquired. On behalf of Islamic Network, Terry, thank you very much. From me personally, as your long-term friend, I must thank you for gracing us with your presence and honoring us. It's certainly been enlightening for me, and I'm sure for the rest of us, and I'm sure for Maulana Imran as well.
Don't forget a box of biryani.
Yes, as you see there, there's an invitation as well, Terry, to join us for biryani. So yes, as I said, oh, inshallah, yes. So on behalf of the Islamic Network, we would like to call upon Terry to please rise, because we want to, the Islamic Network would like to present to you something that would be a first, and that is the dirham that has been minted here in Cape Town by the Islamic Network, and we hope that you will use this not just to benefit yourself, but inshallah to inform others of this amazing new currency that is about to be launched in South Africa.
Wow.
And I hope that you will benefit by the use thereof.
Thank you very much. I'm most honored. Thank you. It's 35 Rand.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow.
And of course, the person that you have to thank is none other than Mona Imran Hosein, because he's been the inspiration behind this initiative.
Thank you.